Christmas Island once functioned flawlessly thanks to tens of millions of red crabs.
They have a widespread effect on the whole ecology of the island. Their burrows till the soil, their feces provide nutrients for the soil, and they're selective in the seeds and seedlings that they eat, so they have an effect on the structure of the rainforest that grows on the island as well.
But in the mid-20th century, that balance collapsed when the yellow crazy ant arrived. They overwhelmed and killed entire colonies of red crabs, causing the island's ecological foundation to crumble from beneath the soil. Wildlife managers tried every possible restoration strategy, yet nothing worked. Until an unexpected clue emerged. From that clue came a bold new approach, one powerful enough to change the fate of the entire island. An isolated paradise and the pillar of its ecosystem. In the middle of the Indian Ocean, 217 miles south of Java and more than 1,600 miles from Perth, a small island rises from the sea. This is Christmas Island, the exposed tip of a massive undersea volcano nearly 5 kilometers tall, with only a thin portion 360 meters height breaking the surface. That small rise is enough to support an ecosystem almost completely isolated from the outside world. This isolation allowed the island's wildlife to evolve along a very different path. And the most surprising part is that the entire system revolves around a single species, the Christmas Island red crab. In most tropical forests, the work of clearing fallen leaves, keeping the ground open for water to pass through and controlling the density of young plants is shared by many different animals. On Christmas Island, every one of those tasks is carried out by the red crabs alone. They dig millions of small burrows that keep the soil loose and breathable, feed on leaf litter so it does not pile up into a suffocating layer, and thin out clusters of saplings by eating the ones that grow too close together. The rhythm of the forest depends on these slow, constant movements. When the crabs thrive, the entire ecosystem runs smoothly. When their numbers fall, the forest begins to slip out of balance. What makes them even more extraordinary is their breeding cycle. In October and November, when the first rains arrive, millions of red crabs leave their burrows at the same moment and travel from the forest to the sea. It is one of the most remarkable migrations in the natural world. Males reach the coastline first and prepare the mating burrows, and females follow several days later, selecting partners and carrying nearly 100,000 eggs beneath their bodies. The timing of the entire island seems to follow the moon. In the final phase of the lunar cycle, just minutes before dawn, every female releases her eggs together at the edge of the water. As soon as the eggs touch the ocean, they hatch into larvae and drift through the currents for 4 weeks before returning to the shore as tiny juvenile crabs and beginning the difficult journey back into the forest. This spectacle was described by Sir David Attenborough, one of the most influential nature documentary filmmakers in the world, as one of the most memorable moments of his career. The ground turns red, roads are closed, and residents walk alongside the crabs using leaf blowers and small rakes to help them cross safely. The migration is not only beautiful, it is the heartbeat of the island itself. Through this vast biological exchange, nutrients move from the ocean back into the forest, keeping the entire ecosystem healthy. Christmas Island is therefore built on a structure rarely seen anywhere else. A vast ecosystem depends almost entirely on the behavior and survival of one species. When the red crabs flourish, the island remains stable. But if their population is damaged, every layer of the forest, from the soil and young plants to the birds and the smallest insects, bears the cost. This fragile dependence would eventually push the island into the greatest ecological crisis in its history. The invasion of the ant. In the middle of the 20th century, a tiny outsider arrived on the island and quietly began to dismantle a natural order that had held firm for millions of years. It was the Anoplolepis gracilis, yellow crazy ant, a species from Southeast Asia, most likely transported unintentionally on supply ships. No one noticed when they first appeared, since they were scattered in small numbers and did not cause obvious change. But everything shifted once they found what every invasive species needs: a place with no natural enemies and a constant source of food. Once established, the yellow crazy ants expanded at a pace the forest had never seen. They did not build small, separate nests like many other ant species. Instead, they formed enormous super colonies, networks that stretched across hundreds of acres and behaved like a single, cooperating organism. One super colony on the island was recorded at more than 1,800 acres, filled with countless workers moving around the clock. In the areas they occupied, ant density could exceed 1,000 individuals per square meter. The forest floor appeared to move because under every glance lay a restless layer of yellow ants. Their most dangerous weapon was formic acid, a potent chemical sprayed when they attacked. When a red crab wandered into their territory, hundreds or even thousands of ants swarmed at once, aiming for the eyes and the joints of its legs. The acid blinded the crab, paralyzed it, and left it defenseless. Within hours, an animal many times larger and protected by a hard shell could collapse. From the late 1990s onward, these attacks killed between 10 and 15 million red crabs, wiping out nearly 1/3 of the island's population and leaving entire sections of forest silent and empty of the crimson migrations that had once covered the ground. The loss of the red crabs triggered a chain reaction that plunged the ecosystem into decline. Without the crabs cleaning the forest floor, leaf litter piled up into a thick layer that trapped nutrients. Young plants grew in dense clusters until they choked one another. Areas that had once been open and easy to walk through became tangled and impenetrable. Birds lost their food sources. Small reptiles vanished from places that once supported them. Light, moisture, and airflow changed, creating a new microclimate that the forest was not built to withstand. Even the migration routes of the crabs turned into death zones, scattered with shells eaten away by acid. The damage did not stop at nature. The annual red crab migration had been the island's most famous event, drawing visitors from around the world and supporting a major part of the local economy. When the crabs disappeared, tourism collapsed with them. The rainforest no longer functioned as it had for thousands of years, and every level of the ecosystem, from the canopy to the soil, showed signs of strain. What made the situation truly terrifying was that the yellow crazy ants did not stop with the red crabs. Once a super colony established itself, anything small enough to overpower became a target. They sprayed acid on hatchling birds, young lizards, and native insects. They did not behave like a single invasive species. They behaved like a force capable of reshaping the structure of the entire forest. Ecological collapse. In the early 2000s, environmental managers began using the strongest tool available to them. They deployed poison bait laced with fipronil, an insecticide mixed into protein pellets that ants found irresistible. Ranger teams had to walk straight into the heart of the super colonies, places where the ground seemed to move because the ants were so dense, and spread the bait by hand, meter by meter. It was dangerous and exhausting work. If they slowed down even for a few weeks, the ants expanded across new sections of forest at a pace no one could keep up with. When hand-laying the bait was no longer enough, they turned to helicopters to release it from above, covering the remote forest sectors that were too dense for humans to reach. These large-scale drops could dramatically reduce ant numbers for a short period, but the success never lasted. As soon as the bait lost its effect, yellow, crazy ants from untreated areas moved in and reclaimed every patch of ground previously cleared. The effort quickly became a repeating cycle of suppression, followed by resurgence. Each round demanded more labor, more money, and more time than the island could afford. While people struggled to contain the infestation, the forest continued to transform in alarming ways. Without the red crabs clearing leaf litter, the forest floor began to accumulate thick layers of decaying leaves. This buildup clogged the natural decomposition processes that usually recycle nutrients through the soil. As the litter deepened, the ground became colder, darker, and unable to absorb water properly. Seedlings grew densely in these conditions, forming tangled thickets that blocked sunlight and rewired the entire structure of the rainforest. These changes spread through every ecological layer. Native birds lost feeding grounds. Small reptiles that depended on open forest floors disappeared from their former habitats. Populations of native insects declined as yellow crazy ants occupied every available niche. Entire stretches of forest that had once been alive with the sounds of wildlife became unsettlingly quiet. The decline of the red crabs triggered another problem. The African giant snail, an invasive species already present on the island, suddenly began to multiply. In the past, the crab's constant gardening made it difficult for the snails to thrive, but the new layer of leaf litter and the dense growth of saplings created the perfect environment for them to spread. What had once been a stable ecosystem now became a chain reaction of cascading imbalances, each one compounding the next. The damage extended beyond nature. The annual red crab migration, once the defining symbol of the island and a major attraction for visitors, vanished from many areas. Tourism fell sharply. Local residents lost income tied to the seasonal influx of travelers, and Christmas Island's image in the world shifted. A place once described as an isolated paradise now stood as one of the most striking examples of how quickly an ecosystem can decline under the pressure of an invasive species. An unexpected discovery in Malaysia. After years of fighting the yellow crazy ants head-on and gaining almost no lasting ground, ecologists began asking a different question. How could this species maintain such enormous population densities? Killing worker ants offered only a temporary victory, because the super colonies kept expanding. It became clear that humans were attacking the wrong part of the system. They were targeting the soldiers without understanding who was supplying the army. As researchers studied the areas dominated by the ants, they noticed a recurring pattern. Wherever yellow crazy ants were found, there were also large numbers of yellow lac-scale insects. These scale insects clung to leaves and stems to feed on plant sap. After feeding, they excreted a sugary liquid known as honeydew, which the ants consumed in huge quantities. Instead of feeding on scattered scraps like native ants, the yellow crazy ants had access to a constant and highly concentrated source of energy. This sugary fuel allowed the super colonies to maintain nonstop activity. The relationship went both ways. The ants protected the scale insects as if they were livestock. They chased away predators, carried the scales to new host plants when old ones were drained, and harvested honeydew as a steady food supply. When researchers separated the ants from the scale insects in test plots, ant activity dropped by 95% within 4 weeks. This was the clearest possible evidence that the ants' strength was not drawn from the island's natural environment. It came from their partnership with the scales. But the scale insects were damaging the forest as well. They drained sap from the trees, and the excess honeydew triggered the growth of sooty mold, a black fungus that smothered leaves and killed many large trees. The threat of the yellow crazy ant did not come from the ants alone. It came from a two-tiered invasion. One species supplied the numbers, the other supplied the fuel. Once this link was identified, a new question emerged. How could the scale insects be reduced without harming the forest? Spraying pesticides across the island was impossible, since they would endanger native plants and animals. The solution had to come from elsewhere, specifically from a place where the scale insects never achieved high densities: Malaysia. Ecological surveys from Malaysia showed that the yellow lac scale almost never reached outbreak levels there. This led researchers to suspect that a natural enemy existed in that region, one capable of keeping the scale insects under control. After extensive fieldwork, they found it: Tachardia summervilli, a parasitic wasp only 2 millimeters long. Inserting its eggs directly into their bodies, when the larvae hatched, they consumed the scale from the inside until it died. The most important discovery was its astonishing host specificity. The wasp attacked only the yellow lac scale. It did not harm other insects, did not damage plants, and posed no danger to humans. To confirm this, scientists tested the wasp on 8 related scale species. The results were unmistakable. The wasp ignored every one of them except the species fueling the ant invasion on Christmas Island. This was precisely the breakthrough researchers had hoped for, a way to hit the heart of the invasion rather than its outer edges. Introducing a new organism into a natural environment required extreme caution. Because of this, Australia's Department of Agriculture carried out one of the most rigorous assessments in the history of the country's biocontrol programs. They evaluated risks, modeled long-term ecological impacts, consulted with the public, and only after every line of evidence indicated full safety was approval granted. The source of the invasion's power had finally been revealed. And from that point forward, Christmas Island entered a new chapter, one shaped by an ambitious attempt to use nature itself as the tool to restore what nature had lost. The transformation of the island. In December 2016, the first group of 167 wasps arrived on Christmas Island after being transported from Malaysia. They could not be released into the wild immediately. Instead, scientists built controlled rearing facilities that recreated the temperature, humidity, and light conditions of the island's rainforest. Branches were brought in and populated with scale insects, so the wasps had both food and a safe environment to reproduce. Each wasp generation took several weeks to mature, and the team's first mission was to multiply their numbers until there were enough to send into the areas most heavily infested. By 2017, about 8,000 wasps were released across 4 key locations: Grants Well, Blowholes, Margaret Knoll, and the Circuit Tracks. These were the strongholds where the scale insects and the yellow crazy ants had formed their most intense super colonies. The release strategy followed 2 paths. Some wasps were released directly into the forest, while others were reared in ideal conditions to quickly boost their numbers before being sent outside. The first wasps disappeared quietly into the canopy, beginning their search for the only target they were biologically programmed to attack: the scale insects. The impact did not appear immediately, but after several months, scientists noticed subtle changes in the areas where the wasps had established themselves. The number of scale insects dropped sharply. With their sugar source cut off, the yellow crazy ants began to weaken. Their activity slowed. They struggled to maintain large colonies. They could no longer form new super colonies. In some monitoring zones, ant numbers fell from around 700 individuals per square meter to as low as 10. No baiting campaign had ever achieved a reduction of this scale. The most unexpected change occurred below the surface. After decades of being suppressed by the ants, the underground network of fungal mycorrhizae and soil microorganisms began to recover. This hidden system is the engine that drives decomposition, breaking down leaves and returning nutrients to the trees. As the ants declined, this subterranean engine started running again, pulling the forest back toward balance. The weakening of the ants made one thing clear: Christmas Island had not been overwhelmed by a single species. It had been overwhelmed by a 2-tier invasion. The scale insects supplied the energy, and the ants supplied the army. When the parasitic wasp severed the supply tier, the entire structure collapsed. The strongest signal of recovery came from the red crabs, the species that had suffered the most. For many years, the number of adult crabs had remained between 40 and 50 million. But after the wasps spread across the island, the crab population began to grow again. By 2024, their numbers reached 100 million, doubling the long-term population estimate. Migration routes that had fallen silent turned red once more, and areas previously dominated by ants began to show young crabs returning to the forest. Recovery appeared not only on the forest floor. Vegetation opened up. Seedling density returned to healthy levels. African giant snails declined where the ants receded. Native reptiles, frogs, and fledgling birds returned to places that had once been lifeless due to the ants' formic acid attacks. An ecosystem that had collapsed across multiple levels was slowly reconnecting its broken links. Releasing the wasps did not eliminate the yellow crazy ants entirely, nor had that ever been the goal. What mattered was that the ants no longer held the power to dominate the landscape or rebuild their super colonies. Christmas Island had finally struck at the one weakness that mattered. Not the army, but the fuel that kept the army alive. The emergence of a new ecosystem. Despite the strong signs of recovery, Christmas Island had not fully escaped the threat of the yellow crazy ant. In remote areas of rainforest divided by cliffs, ravines, and dense canopies, the ants continued to survive in scattered pockets. These places were too difficult to reach with bait or with sustained wasp releases. The island's long-term objective was never to completely eradicate the ants, a goal considered nearly impossible, but to push them down to levels low enough that the native ecosystem could continue to function on its own. After 2020, the management strategy entered a phase of refinement. Ecologists began using a combination of tools: parasitic wasps to cut the ants' carbohydrate supply, targeted baiting to suppress smaller flare-ups, and continuous monitoring to detect new outbreaks before they grew. In 2021, they even evaluated the possibility of introducing a different parasitic wasp from Africa, one capable of attacking adult ants directly. But because this species was known to damage agriculture in Australia, the idea required years of study to ensure complete safety. While these future options were being examined, another reality began to emerge. The ecosystem of Christmas Island was not simply returning to its pre-invasion state. It was moving toward a new form of operation. The red crabs, whose numbers rose from about 45 to 50 million to more than 100 million by 2024, began shaping the forest in ways even scientists had not predicted. The forest floor regained its natural rhythm. Leaf litter was processed continuously. Dense layers of seedlings were thinned naturally by the crabs. Nutrient cycling became smoother than in previous decades. The migration routes once again became major natural events that drew visitors from around the world, and hotels on the island filled up months in advance. Recovery extended beyond the ground layer. Native species that had once approached critical levels, including fledgling birds and small lizards, began appearing in surveys again. Areas that had been choked by dense vegetation, where sunlight barely reached the soil, opened into natural clearings, allowing the forest to breathe properly. Secondary invasive species like the African giant snail disappeared from places where the red crabs reclaimed territory. Since the conditions that favored the snails no longer existed, these signs of renewal raised a larger question. Was Christmas Island returning to its old ecological identity, or was it evolving into something entirely new? The answer was not simple. The ecosystem no longer resembled its structure from before the 20th century. Too many components had changed permanently. The scattered presence of yellow crazy ants still created a subtle pressure that the ecosystem had to adapt to. But the unexpectedly strong rebound of the red crabs opened the possibility of a new ecological model, one where leaf decomposition, vegetation structure, and the distribution of small animals might follow patterns different from anything seen in the island's natural history. This was the moment when the value of biological control became most evident. The introduction of the parasitic wasp had not only saved the red crabs, it had reshaped the trajectory of the forest's recovery. It showed that in rare circumstances, introducing an outside species, when thoroughly researched and carefully monitored, could produce benefits far greater than the risks. From a broader viewpoint, the story of Christmas Island reflects a global problem. Invasive species threaten ecosystems across every continent, from tropical forests to deserts, from cities to the deep ocean. In many cases, traditional methods such as chemicals or manual removal offer only temporary relief. But the success of the parasitic wasp on Christmas Island raises a larger question. Are we ready to rely on the smallest organisms to save entire ecosystems? It is a question that reaches far beyond Christmas Island. It touches the future of many ecosystems now standing at the edge of survival.